All right, ready to dive deep. Today we're tackling ancient Greek philosophy, but with a twist. We're looking at Pyrrho of Elais. And he's not your typical, toga-wearing philosopher.
He's a real enigma.
Yeah, the mystery man of philosophy. See, Pyrrho didn't write anything down himself.
Not a single word as far as we know.
So we're left with these fragments and stories from other people, kind of like piecing together a puzzle, right?
Exactly, a philosophical puzzle. We've got these intriguing anecdotes about his, unshakable calmness.
I heard he just ignored, cliffs and stuff. Didn't even flinch.
Yeah, stories like that abound. And then there are these whispers of connections to Indian mystics, which is a whole other rabbit hole.
Seriously, Indian mystics. That's wild. Okay, so we're dealing with a thinker shrouded in mystery, but whose ideas, from what we can glean, are still relevant even today.
Absolutely. The picture that emerges is someone who truly lived a life free from worry. Someone who seemed to achieve a level of tranquility that most of us can only dream of.
So how do we even begin to unravel this philosophical puzzle? Where do we start?
Well, like you said, we're relying on secondhand accounts, these echoes from the past.
Right, whispers and fragments.
Our main sources are Timon of Phlius, who was a follower of Pyrrho. He wrote poems and stuff, but only bits and pieces remain.
Ah, so we're getting Pyrrho filtered through Timon's perspective.
Exactly. And then there's Aristocles, a later philosopher who summarized Timon's account. So it's like a game of telephone, in a way.
Layers upon layers. Makes it even more intriguing, don't you think? But okay, let's get to the heart of it. What did these accounts actually tell us about Pyrrho? What makes him stand out from all the other philosophers?
One of the most striking things is his legendary impassivity, his unwavering calmness.
Like the cliff thing, right?
Yeah.
Seriously, how do you just ignore a cliff?
Right. Stories abound about his ability to remain unfazed, even in situations that would send most of us into a panic. It's as if he had mastered this state of ataraxia, freedom from worry and mental disturbance.
Okay, ignoring cliffs aside, was there a method to this calmness? I mean, was it just a personality quirk, or was there a philosophical foundation to this way of life?
That's the key question, right? Was this just Pyrrho being Pyrrho, or was there a deliberate system behind it? And luckily, Aristocles gives us some clues. He tells us that Pyrrho believed happiness hinged on 3 fundamental questions. And honestly, these questions are still so relevant today.
3 questions to happiness. Okay, I'm listening. Lay 'em on me.
The first one is, what are things really like? This gets at the very nature of reality itself.
Deep stuff.
Right. Are things inherently good or bad, or is that just something we project onto them?
Okay, so first, understand the essence of reality. What's next?
The second question is, how should we react to things given their true nature? So this is about our disposition towards the world, right? Should we cling to our judgments, our beliefs, or is there a more flexible approach?
So first, understand reality, then figure out the appropriate response. Makes sense. What's the third question? The grand finale.
The third question is, what happens if we react in a particular way? This one focuses on the outcome, the goal. Does our reaction lead to happiness and peace or more turmoil?
Okay, the nature of things, our reaction to them, and the consequences. Big questions. How did Pyrrho approach answering them? What was his take on all this?
Well, to answer that first question, what are things really like? Pyrrho used these Greek terms, adiaphora, asthmeta, and anapikrita.
Whoa, hold on. Even I don't speak ancient Greek.
Fair enough. Essentially, he's saying that things are indifferent, unstable, and indeterminate. They don't have an inherent fixed nature.
So it's not that we just can't figure them out, it's that they don't have a fixed essence.
Right. And there are 2 main ways to interpret this idea, 2 paths we could go down.
Ooh, a philosophical fork in the road. I'm intrigued. Walk us through these 2 interpretations.
So the first one is the metaphysical Pyrrho. This interpretation suggests that things themselves are inherently indefinite, lacking fixed features. It's not just that we can't know what they are, it's that they don't have a fixed essence. We try to impose our categories on a reality that's fundamentally fluid, always changing.
It's like trying to nail down a cloud. Our labels just don't stick.
Exactly. Now, the second interpretation is the epistemological Pyrrho. This one focuses more on our ability to know things, to grasp their true nature.
So instead of saying reality is indefinite, this view says we just can't truly know what it's like because we're limited.
Right. Our senses are imperfect. Our opinions are subjective. We can never be absolutely sure about the objective truth of things.
2 very different perspectives on the same fundamental idea. And both raise some pretty huge questions about how we see the world, how we form our beliefs, and ultimately, how we live our lives.
Exactly. And that's where things start to get really interesting. Because now that we have a grasp on these two interpretations of Pyrrho's view of reality, we can start to explore how he answered those remaining two questions, how we should react and what outcomes we can expect. And this is where we get into some of his most radical and intriguing ideas like aphasia and ataraxia.
Okay, I am officially hooked. We'll have to pick up this philosophical investigation in part 2 of our deep dive into Pyrrho.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Pyrrho. When we left off, we were talking about those two interpretations of his view of reality, the metaphysical and the epistemological.
Yeah, it's like we're on this philosophical adventure and we've reached a fork in the path. Each interpretation gives us a different way of understanding Pyrrho's ideas.
And remember, we're working with these fragments and interpretations, so there's always a degree of ambiguity involved, but that's part what makes it so fascinating.
Absolutely. So let's pick up where we left off. Let's explore each of these paths, starting with the metaphysical Pyrrho.
Okay, so if we go down this path, we're accepting the idea that things are inherently indefinite, that they don't have this fixed, stable nature.
Right. It's not just that we can't know what they are, it's that they don't have a fixed essence. It's like the ground is constantly shifting beneath our feet.
Exactly. So how does this view, this metaphysical perspective, affect how we understand the world around us?
Well, if things are truly indefinite, then our judgments about them, good or bad, right or wrong, they become a lot less certain.
Right, because those judgments are based on our perceptions, our interpretations, not on some absolute truth about the thing itself.
It's like, imagine looking at a tree. We might describe it as tall, green, strong. But the metaphysical Pyrrho would say those are just labels, just our interpretations. The tree itself doesn't possess those qualities inherently.
Exactly. It challenges those assumptions we have about how the world works.
It's like saying beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but for everything.
Yes, and that has huge implications for how we react to things. Which leads us to Pyrrho's second question. How should we react, given the nature of things?
Right, if things are always changing, always in flux, it seems to point toward a certain kind of detachment, a letting go of our rigid beliefs and judgments.
Exactly, and this is where the idea of aphasia comes in. It's often translated as speechlessness or non-assertion.
So does that mean we should all just stop talking? Take a vow of silence?
Not quite. It's not about being literally mute. It's more about recognizing the limitations of language and the dangers of those dogmatic pronouncements.
I see. So instead of saying, this is definitely good, you'd say something like, this appears good to me right now,
Yeah.
acknowledging that other perspectives exist and that things might change.
Precisely. It's about humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers. It's a way of speaking that reflects a deep awareness of those limitations of human knowledge.
It's a fascinating concept. But honestly, it sounds really hard to put into practice. We humans, we love to categorize things, to debate, to be right.
Absolutely. But for Pyrrho, aphasia wasn't just this philosophical exercise, it was a way of life. It was a path towards achieving a greater peace of mind.
I see. So by letting go of that need to be right, to have those definite answers, he was freeing himself from a lot of mental turmoil.
Now let's shift gears a bit and explore the implications of that second interpretation, the epistemological Pyrrho.
Okay, so with this one, we're focusing on the limitations of human knowledge. We're saying that we just can't fully know what reality is like because our tools for knowing, our senses, our reasoning, they're inherently flawed.
Right. Think about optical illusions. They show us how easily our senses can be tricked. And even when our reasoning seems perfectly logical, it can be influenced by unconscious biases and all sorts of assumptions.
So basically, we're always seeing the world through this distorted lens, and we can never be completely sure if we're perceiving things accurately.
Which leads to a slightly different kind of detachment than the metaphysical Pyrrho. It's not so much about the nature of reality itself, but about our ability to grasp it.
We suspend judgment, not because things are inherently indeterminate, but because we recognize those limits of our own knowing.
And that leads to a certain humility, a willingness to admit we don't have all the answers. And that's a key part of achieving ataraxia.
It's like saying, I might be wrong about this, but not just about one specific thing, about everything.
It's a humbling perspective, for sure. We live in a world that's constantly bombarding us with information and opinions, and it's so easy to get caught up in that need to take a stance, to have a definite answer.
Right, like we have to have an opinion on everything.
Exactly. But the epistemological Pyrrho reminds us that it's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to admit that our knowledge is always partial, always incomplete.
In fact, it might be the key to a more peaceful, balanced way of life. Less stress about being right, more curiosity about what we might be missing.
Now, regardless of which path we choose, which interpretation resonates more, there's this common thread that runs through both the metaphysical and epistemological Pyrrho, a deep skepticism about the certainty of our beliefs and judgments.
It's like he's holding up a mirror, forcing us to confront those ways we cling to beliefs that might not be as solid as we think they are.
And that challenge, that invitation to question, is what makes Pyrrho so compelling, even thousands of years later. He forces us to think differently, to approach the world with a healthy dose of skepticism and humility.
So we've covered a lot of ground here talking about Pyrrho's ideas, but there's this one aspect we haven't touched on yet, his unique speech patterns. Apparently he had this unusual way of expressing himself that reflected his non-committal stance.
Yes, it said that he rarely made definitive statements. Instead of saying, honey is sweet, he might say, honey appears sweet to me, or honey is no more sweet than bitter.
Wow, so he was constantly hedging, refusing to be pinned down. That must have been frustrating for people who were used to more straightforward answers.
Perhaps. But it's a powerful way of putting his philosophy into practice. It's a constant reminder to question our assumptions, to remember that our perceptions are just that, perceptions, not absolute truth.
It's like he was embodying his philosophy in his very way of speaking. But this raises a practical question for me. If Pyrrho was so skeptical, so non-committal, how did he actually, live in the world? How did he make decisions and navigate everyday life?
That's a great question. And it leads us to one of the more perplexing aspects of Pyrrho's philosophy, his reliance on what he called appearances.
Okay, so last time we were talking about how Pyrrho made decisions. I mean, if he doubted our ability to truly know things, how did he actually live his life? Did he just walk around in a constant state of, I don't know?
Not really. No, there's evidence that suggests he relied on what he called appearances. It's a tricky concept, though, so let's be careful how we unpack it.
All right, appearances. So even though he questioned our ability to know things for sure, he still acknowledged that how things appear to us in the moment matters.
Okay, I'm following so far, but how's that different from just, going with your gut? Is it just a fancy way of saying do what feels right? It's more nuanced than just going with your gut. I think following your gut can be impulsive, reacting without thinking things through. For Pyrrho, relying on appearances seems to be more about careful observation of the situation without imposing our judgments or desires.
So it's about being present, really paying attention to what's happening around us.
Yeah.
And not letting our biases cloud our perception. It's almost like a form of mindfulness, right?
Yeah, you're onto something there. It's a very grounded approach, recognizing that, hey, we have to make choices, even when we're not totally certain. But instead of relying on these rigid beliefs or abstract principles, we should look to the specifics of the situation, to how things actually appear to us at that moment.
So it's about staying open to the experience, to the ever-changing nature of things. Makes sense, considering his overall philosophy. Which brings us to that final riddle, the one about the nature of the divine and the good. If Pyrrho was all about uncertainty, how does this fit in?
It's a really tricky one. This fragment from Timon has been puzzling scholars for centuries. It almost seems to suggest that, maybe Pyrrho made an exception to his skepticism when it came to the divine and the good. Like maybe he believed in something eternal, unchanging.
Wait, hold on. I thought we established that Pyrrho was all about questioning everything. Didn't he say things are indeterminate, lacking a fixed essence? How can he believe in something absolute like the divine?
Right. That's the million-dollar question. And there are a few different ways to approach it. Some argue that Pyrrho might have seen the divine and the good as these fundamental truths that transcended all the uncertainty.
Okay, so maybe he saw these concepts as a kind of anchor.
Yeah.
A grounding point in this world that's always in flux.
Right.
It would explain how he was able to achieve that level of tranquility if he had something to hold on to amidst all the chaos.
That's one way to look at it, but some find it hard to reconcile with the rest of his philosophy. They suggest that Timon, as a poet, might have just been using a bit of literary flourish to emphasize Pyrrho's state of mind.
So instead of a literal belief in the divine, it's more like a poetic way of expressing Pyrrho's unshakable peace, like saying someone has a divine aura without actually meaning they're a deity or something.
Precisely. It wouldn't be the first time a philosopher has used poetic language to get their point across, and then there's a more radical interpretation. Some suggest that Timon might have been using irony or even sarcasm.
Irony. From an ancient philosopher, now we're going deep down the rabbit hole.
I know, right? But Timon was known for his wit, his satirical style. Maybe he was subtly poking fun at those other philosophical schools that clung to these big, grand theories about the divine and the good.
Instead of endorsing this belief in something absolute, he's actually highlighting how absurd it is to make such claims in a world full of uncertainty. That's a pretty bold move.
It is. And it would definitely align with Pyrrho's whole thing, questioning assumptions and rejecting dogma.
So it seems we're left with a mystery, a fragment that just doesn't fit neatly into any one explanation, which I guess is fitting for a philosopher as elusive as Pyrrho.
And maybe that's part of the beauty of ancient philosophy. We're often left with more questions than answers. It's like piecing together this ancient puzzle with some pieces missing. We might never have those definitive answers, but the searching, the inquiry, is what makes it so enriching.
Exactly. It reminds us that there's always more to learn, more to question, more to explore. Pyrrho might not give us all the answers, but he pushes us to think differently, to embrace uncertainty, and to find peace not in dogma, but in the very act of questioning.
So, to our listeners, what did you find most intriguing about Pyrrho? Did his ideas challenge your assumptions? Did they leave you with more questions than answers? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them with us, and let's keep this conversation going.